You might want to sit down for what I'm about to tell you, just not on a precarious ledge, because I'm coming at you with the messed up origins of a man who paid no heed to where he parked his posterior and paid the price. I am, of course, talking about Humpty Dumpty. You remember him, right? He sat on a wall, fell off it, and died? It's a riveting story. Obviously, you remember him, and I'll bet my 7th son soul that when I say Humpty Dumpty's name, you imagine him as a surprisingly well-dressed egg. But what if I told you that you've been lied to your whole life, and that some scholars have suggested he was originally a great king, a powerful siege cannon, a not-so-handsome bachelor, and even a chunky little fat boy? For me personally, learning that Humpty wasn't an egg would be as soul-destroying as finding out I'm adopted, and I know I'm not the only one who feels that way. Gunther does too. So today I've made it my mission to find the true identity of Humpty Dumpty, where the sad little nursery rhyme came from, and why so many imagine him as an egg. And I'm doing it for all of you. And Gunther. One of the most interesting parts of researching nursery rhymes is learning how many different versions of them exist. Because while I guaranteed that most of you watching could recite the most popular nursery rhymes off the top of your head, even if you haven't heard them in years, the lines that you consider iconic may be totally different for someone else. Most every nursery rhyme in the English language has at least a few variations, or did at one point before the others were phased out. But that's actually not the case for Humpty Dumpty. While the phrasing has changed slightly since its original publication, everyone nowadays agrees that these are the lyrics. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. That version goes at least as far back as 1882. With the oldest record we have of it coming from a collection of songs sung at Yale College. But the oldest version we found ever, published 150 years prior in 1797 in Samuel Arnold's children's book Juvenile Amusements, the lyrics are nearly the same besides the last two lines. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. 80 men and 80 more could not make Humpty Dumpty where he was before. What makes the inclusion in Samuel Arnold's book extra noteworthy, though, is that he phrased the rhyme as a riddle, and it was the reader's job to figure out what kind of being Humpty Dumpty was. Not unlike what scientists have been trying to do with Kirby for years. But here's where life gives us a swift kick in the old egg sack. The answer to the riddle has been lost, along with the majority of the rest of the book, destroyed by the sands of time. You can find a handful of really low quality scans online, but to be honest with you, I was not able to track down a scan of the Humpty Dumpty rhyme I just quoted. And this is one of those times where every available source online just refers back to Wikipedia. Now, to its credit, the Wikipedia page does cite the Oxford Dictionary of Nursery Rhymes written by the well-respected folklorists Iona and Peter Opie. However, their book doesn't show a scan of Arnold's original document either. It just describes it through text. So we gotta have faith that the Opies somehow saw the OG document with their eyeballs and weren't just quoting some other folklorist's work. Getting back to my original point though, the answer to the riddle may no longer exist in the book, but there are clues to be found elsewhere on the timeline. For example, there is the first use of the Humpty Dumpty name, which I was only able to track down thanks to this great blog post by Mike Sutton. Sutton discovered a poem called A Rod for Tunbridge Bows, published in 1701, where a series of suitors are comically described. These potential lovers, referred to as beaux, have some great names too. There's Poutmouth, Catchfart, and as you may have figured out, Humpty Dumpty. Now, Humpty Dumpty is given a long-winded description that goes completely off the rails, dovetailing into a side quest where he's the midwife to a pregnant cow. But that's besides the point. The most relevant lines are in the very beginning, when Beau Humpty Dumpty is described as a merry lump, well grown in years, with back and breast like Punchinello. It's a safe assumption that Punchinello refers to the centuries-old Italian clown character who was usually portrayed with a spherical physique. Mike Sutton also points out that in 1785, a dictionary of vulgar language was published, which you can think of as the great-grandparent to Urban Dictionary. It defined Humpty Dumpty as a short, clumsy person of either sex, also ale boiled with brandy, further proving that the Humpty Dumpty name has always been used for characters with short, squat, nearly egg-shaped bodies by the general public. By the time Samuel Arnold published the riddle in Juvenile Amusements in 1797, the character had likely evolved from being just egg-shaped to being a straight-up egg, so the answer to the riddle would have been widely known. And if, by chance, the character's egg form was not firmly established yet, Lewis Carroll's portrayal of Humpty in Alice Through the Looking Glass eliminated any hope that character had of being a sex icon. And here's where things get really interesting, at least to me. I was rereading my copy of the Annotated Alice, which has a ton of behind-the-scenes info about both stories, and I found a citation in the chapter about Humpty Dumpty that says, while most people cite John Tenniel's illustrations as the first visual representation of the character as an egg, there is one other that came before.
Just one other.
In 1843, 22 years before the second Alice book was published, Samuel Edward Maberly, a fellow Oxford alumni, illustrated an accordion-style frieze that told Humpty's story as the pages were unfolded. It was titled The Pictorial Humpty Dumpty. Now, there's no argument that Carroll's is the most famous egg portrayal and had a tremendous influence over Humpty's public image, but I think that earlier illustration is worth mentioning because it shows the general public imagined him as an egg before Carroll came along. Although, it didn't stop other representations from slipping through the cracks, like this Book of Mother Goose Rhymes from 1877 that shows Humpty as a rotund little lad, who I'm assuming, based on his pose, has IBS. But I also can't help but wonder how much of Humpty's history Carroll was aware of, because Alice Through the Looking Glass contains a few connections to his origins. As you would expect, he's precariously perched on a wall.
Do you think you should be perched on the edge of the building like this?
He presents Alice with multiple riddles to solve, and he's fascinated by linguistics, like Beau Humpty Dumpty from the Tunbridge Bows poem, who's described as a poet, one of universal knowledge and deeper learned than a whole college. Not to mention, you would have to be somewhat interested in linguistics in order to figure out what kind of being Humpty Dumpty is meant to be. With that in mind, there is a great moment from the book where Alice tells Humpty Dumpty that he's shaped like an egg, and he gets extremely offended, saying it's provoking to be compared to an egg. But I don't blame him for being sensitive, considering he's probably used to people solving his riddles shouting out, "Humpty Dumpty's an egg! Humpty Dumpty's an egg!" Talk about a cursed existence. Now, personally, I find this timeline of Humpty's evolution from a bizarre bachelor to an egg to make some sense. It's not perfect, and some assumptions are made, but at least there's a paper trail we can follow. That being said, not everybody is willing to dig as deep as we are to find the truth, and some just don't know any better. As a result, some pretty ridiculous theories have grown in popularity in recent decades, despite there being more evidence to disprove them than prove them. So I'm gonna dive into and demolish those theories next. First, though, I want to take things in a different direction. We've been talking a lot about eggs and circular shapes, so let me take a minute to balance the scales and talk about our sponsor, Squarespace. Nope, transitions don't get smoother than that. Having a well-designed website for potential customers and clients to learn about your business is crucial for finding success regardless of your niche, and Squarespace makes it easier than you ever dreamed was possible. They have an AI-powered website generator that can conjure up a fully fleshed-out professional site after a few simple questions about your business and your goals. They've completely eliminated the need to code thanks to their Fluid engine, which just lets you drag and drop elements where you want them, and they even adapt your site to mobile screens for you so you don't have to stress about it. I even use Squarespace to build my own website. Me, an actual idiot. On messeduporigins.com, you'll find links to our various YouTube series, a page to listen to the podcast, and even a link to the Mere Mortal store where we sell all our merch. If I can set all that up without any calls to their award-winning customer support team, you can too. But if you do need some support, they're available 24/7. To try Squarespace completely free, go to squarespace.com/Jon Solo or hit the link in the description. Then make sure to use code Jon Solo to get 10% off your first purchase. While most people have come to accept Humpty Dumpty as an unfertilized organic vessel that normally contains the zygote in which an embryo develops, an egg, there are some silly people out there who still think that he was inspired by a real person or a thing. What I think is the oldest known attempt to give Humpty Dumpty some kind of messed up origin can be found in the real personages of Mother Goose. The author, Catherine L. West Thomas, suggested that Humpty was inspired by King Richard III of England, her evidence being the line about all the king's horses and all the king's men, King Richard's defeat, or Great Fall, at Bosworth Field in 1485, and the fact that he was supposedly known for being hunchbacked and having fragile limbs.
Ow.
There are several issues with this, though. For starters, Richard ruled in the late 1400s, and the oldest written record of the rhyme, or riddle, is from the early 1700s. 300 years later. That would mean the rhyme had to be passed around for centuries without ever being written down, which is possible, but then you have to consider that the oldest version of the rhyme that we have doesn't even mention the king's horses or men, which is half the evidence for the theory. Lastly, and I think this is the most important point, is that King Richard III wasn't even that deformed. Although he had scoliosis, which you can see for yourself in these scans of his skeleton, which I'm sure they got his consent for, he did not have what most would consider a hunched back. And once again, there is no record that anyone living during his time described him that way. In reality, these ideas about Richard were spread by Tudor chroniclers after his death, and further misrepresented in Shakespeare's play The Tragedy of Richard III, where he's portrayed as having a hunchback, a limp, and a withered arm. There have also been several theories suggesting that Humpty Dumpty was the nickname for an old piece of military weaponry, but you should not take these seriously, because the first theory of this type was posited by Professor David Daub in an article that he wrote for Oxford Magazine in 1956. When Iona and Peter Opie refer to the article in the Oxford Dictionary of Nursery Rhymes, they describe it as part of a series of spoof articles. Now, I read his article myself, and I did not get the vibe that Daub was kidding at all, but I didn't read the whole series, so there might be some context that I'm missing. Daub claimed Humpty Dumpty was a siege engine used in 1643 during the English Civil War to breach the walls of the city of Gloucester, and he took some comically massive leaps in logic to prove his point. If he intended his theory to be a joke, it was a little too subtle for the average person to pick up on, because before long it became a local legend that some residents believe to this day. And it went on to inspire a series of copycats. Cities all over England took credit for being the home of the Humpty Dumpty canon through the end of the 20th century. Colchester, England went so far as to post the claim on their website in 1996, back when web design was at its peak, but it's since been taken down. With that in mind, I have to mention my least favorite book on this subject, Pop Goes the Weasel, The Secret Meaning of Nursery Rhymes, because I think it's the most egregious in its misrepresentation of folklore and history. We've already established that this theory likely started as a joke, right? Well, the author of Pop Goes the Weasel doesn't bother to explain that. In fact, he probably didn't even know it when he wrote the book, because he presents the Colchester canon theory, a spin-off of the spoof theory, as if it's verified history. Even more ridiculous, he adds 2 lost verses meant to give the rhyme more context, but then doesn't bother to explain where he found them, or seem to notice that they follow a completely different structure than the main verse. I would also really appreciate an explanation for why the nearly 4 centuries old version ends with all the king's horses and all the king's men, when again, that line didn't exist back then. There's no written record of it until the 1800s, and Albert Jacks doesn't count because he doesn't tell us where he got it from. I understand the pain of not being able to find all the answers to the fascinating question that you proposed. It happens to me basically every week on this show. I hit some kind of dead end because of my lack of knowledge and experience, or because there are genuinely no more leads to follow. It sucks when your investigation is forced to come to a halt before you've managed to connect all the dots, but it's way more admirable to just admit defeat than to fill in the cracks with verbal diarrhea. That book has diarrhea spilling out of the pages. At least if you're honest about your findings, your audience has the option to pick up where you left off and do some digging of their own without a bunch of preconceived misconceptions that now have to be unlearned to make room for reality. As great as it would be for my channel if Humpty Dumpty was a siege cannon, or better yet, a serial killer, it's stupid and selfish to knowingly lie, or at the very least intentionally remain ignorant about the history of the world if you're gonna try to teach others about it. When I originally covered Humpty Dumpty over 6 years ago, I came to a different conclusion than I did today because I misunderstood some of the history, which is why I set it to private just before this episode went live. But as embarrassing as those mistakes are, at least I can say I used all the knowledge and skills I had at that time to make the most honest and entertaining presentation that I could. And I clearly communicated that I was presenting theories. I may not be able to tell you exactly how Humpty evolved from being a bizarre bachelor to an egg, but I can say without a shadow of a doubt that he was never a goddamn canon. Until next time, my name is Jon Solo, and remember, Jon shot first.